Hello, and welcome to Lip Service, a podcast that adventures around and all down the line with the Rolling Stones. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Simon Harper, and I shall be your host for this series of conversations that celebrate the life and music of the greatest rock and roll band in the world. We've got sights and sounds and marvels to delight your eyes and ears, so join us as we journey down the road a piece, from Dartford days to Hackney Diamonds and beyond, exploring the songs and stories from along the way with friends and special guests. Today's guest is Paul Sexton, journalist, broadcaster and author who has spent more than 3 decades documenting the Rolling Stones with intimacy and insight shaped by years of unparalleled access. Over that time, he's interviewed every member of the band, reported from the road, contributed liner notes, created radio documentaries and written countless features for a wide range of UK and US publications. In 2022, Paul published Charlie's Good Tonight, the only authorised biography of Charlie Watts, a project that began while Charlie was still with us and ultimately became a tender, deeply researched tribute, driven by new interviews with the band, Charlie's closest friends and, crucially, his family. In this episode, we talk about how that book came to be, from the early conversations about a potential autobiography to gaining the trust of Charlie's wife, daughter, granddaughter and sister, none of whom had ever spoken publicly before. We discuss Charlie's unique character, his modesty, his humour, his obsessive collecting, his immaculate style and the quiet, steadfast life he built far from the chaos of rock and roll, but also get to grips with the dark depths of his unexpected drug problems in the 80s, and how it was music, and in particular jazz music, that rescued him from self-destruction. Paul reflects on the emotional challenge of writing about someone so private, the unexpected generosity he encountered from Charlie's inner circle, and what he learned about Charlie as both a musician and a man. We also explore Paul's own history with the Stones, from interviewing Mick and Keith in the 90s to witnessing how the band navigated grief after Charlie's death. It's a conversation brimming with warm affection that brings a rich human dimension to a figure so many fans feel they knew, yet so few truly did. Here's me talking with Paul Sexton. Hi Paul, welcome to Lip Service.
Hello Simon, good to be with you.
And you, yeah, it's fitting that we should be talking today since yesterday would have been Charlie Watts' birthday and he was being fondly remembered by fans and friends on social. There was a lot of love going around yesterday.
Yes, there was, and I think there always is, isn't there? That goes all the way around the year, but especially at this time of year. So, of course, it's also a very important anniversary week for Ronnie Wood, so it's quite big in Stones world. But yeah, I always have an extra thought for Charlie around this time.
Yeah, his is a legacy that's clearly going to continue for many years to come.
Without a doubt, and obviously when he sadly passed away, I think we all felt that incredible outpouring of love from people who were mourning him as if they knew him. It's just regular Stones fans who spoke about him like a member of the family or something. Because that was the kind of persona that he adopted. I think in later life, this very avuncular kind of figure in the Stones world. But yeah, it's still there. And actually, I found that. I mean, just the sort of echo, the ripples and the echoes from having worked on the biography of him just go on. I don't think that will stop.
Well, I mean, it's been 3 years since Charlie's Good Tonight was published. How do you reflect on the book now? What does it mean to you today?
Well, as much as it did then, I think, and I do still think about what an honor it was to do it. There's an element of did that really happen kind of thing. And it does amaze me that people are still talking about it, but then that's because they're talking about him. I don't take the credit for that. It's been incredible to see how the book has traveled around the world. It sounds a bit potentially blasé, but I don't mean it that way. I actually have lost count of how many, international editions and translations there've been of it. But that, again, it's a direct reflection of how massive the Stones were absolutely everywhere, So it's that's like I kind of rather glibly say that he's still on tour basically with it, and yeah, people barely a day goes by without some sort of reference to the book somewhere, and things like what we're doing right now, or various other interviews or people asking me about it. So yeah, it's been a lovely thing.
I mean, how immersed were you in Charlie's life? To what extent did he kind of consume you in the process of writing the book?
Well, just to give you the sort of short version of how it worked. So the initial discussions about a book were while he was still with us. So I had an approach from HarperCollins, who turned out to be the publishers, who'd seen, and this was from the guy who turned out to be my publisher on it. He'd seen one of the umpteen features I'd written about the Stones, I think in the Sunday Times. I think it was probably around the time of the one of the big deluxe reissues of Goat's Head Soup, I think it was. And he got in touch with me, said he really liked the piece, and that they had the idea, and I'm sure they were not the first, that they would like to do something with Charlie. So the initial idea was really for me to work with him on an autobiography. That's what they first had in mind. But and we sort of pursued that for a while. But I must say that my initial thought was that that was probably not going to fly for chiefly for the reason that Charlie would never have done it. He was far too modest
Yeah.
to ever have dreamed of doing an autobiography. And I think if he had done it, it would have been kind of kicking and screaming. And from the writer's point of view, if indeed the idea was that I would have either ghosted it or worked very closely with him on it, it would have been a real challenge to do that because I learned pretty early on that much as it was wonderful to be in Charlie's company, he was quite uh, hesitant as a speaker. He would often sort of start saying something, and then there'd be a pregnant pause, and
Yeah.
you'd think. I remember this at the beginning, thinking, "Well, do I jump in here?" And then the car would start again, and he'd finish the thought, and you move on to the next thing. But that would have made it a rather sort of staccato, I think, in tone. So although it's very sad that it turned into something else, from a journalistic point of view, it was better for me because the biography format gave me the opportunity, and of course by that time he'd left us, so there was the chance to not only reflect on the many times that we'd met and use all that archive material with him and with the Stones, of course, but to gather all these new interviews, of which there were many, including all of the band again and family and friends, and just to I hope to paint a sort of a more rich picture of his whole life than you would have got just from one voice.
Had he done any preparation in terms of the autobiography side of
I
things?
don't think so. No, no. I mean, it's even with all of my many decades of working with the Stones, there's things that you grow used to the idea that everything's going to take a while, to to get to the right person or to filter through or to get an answer about. And that was certainly the case here. And for a little while there was the suggestion from the management team that he was not entirely averse to the idea, but that's not the same thing as him actually doing anything about it. I think he would have waited for me to sort of make the approaches.
To take the lead?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, yeah, because really, as I'm sure he had this very unusual attitude towards the Stones, much as he loved them. You know, as we know, he kind of left at the end of every tour for about the last 30 years and was coaxed back into the fold. And when they were not on the road, um, especially in later years, I think they were, mainly quite sort of separate from each other, not in a unfriendly way, but just in their own worlds.
Hmm.
And I don't think he really thought about them all that much. He certainly never played their records or anything like that, So the whole kind of legend of the Stones was something that he found rather mystifying in a strange way.
You mentioned the fact that you had all these interviews from your own past. Can you explain a little bit about your professional journey and what part the Stones played in that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I started writing about music when I was still at school at 17 for Record Mirror, which older listeners may just about remember as one of the pop weeklies of the day in the era when the music press in the UK was collectively very powerful, because it was, and we're talking about the late 70s here, it was the way that people consumed their music, news and features and interviews. long before the days of the daily tabloids starting to have gossip columns or pop news in anyway. So that was my sort of intro into it, and I kind of knew that I wanted to pursue it, so I kind of kept going with that. I did a 1 year journalism course, but I was writing all the way through that anyway. A little bit later on, I added broadcasting to to the mix and started originally producing a syndicated radio show for American radio called Rock Over London, which became very big. It was on at its peak. It's syndicated to about 220 radio stations across the states. So that was very useful, and that in turn, much later on, led me towards making documentaries for BBC Radio 2. But the next sort of step along the way there was when I started finally writing for the what I still call the broadsheets. Occasionally, I still call them the quality press, although that's a debatable description. So that was quite the first thing there was a piece for the Times, and that was quite a way in. That was some way into doing this for a living. But it would have been around that time that I would have first met. In fact, the first of the Stones that I met was Bill.
Right.
He was still in the band, although we didn't know it then, but he was already thinking of his departure. And that interview, as I remember, was not about the Stones at all. It was about his Sticky Fingers restaurant,
Hmm.
which I think he must have just opened at that time in London. The first interview with Charlie was in 1991 when he was being forced, probably, to do the promotional rounds for it was the reissue of the book the beautiful little book that he wrote about, well, picture book that he did about his hero Charlie Parker when he was still at Design College, and that reissue was accompanied by a new EP, I suppose you'd call it, of interpretations, based on or inspired by Charlie, and in one or two cases covers. So he came into the studio where I was recording one of the several in-flight audio shows that I used to do at that time. And we just did a regular interview. I felt after he died, when I was researching the book, I pulled out there was a box set edition of that reissue, and I saw that he'd signed it for me, which is something I've rarely asked for actually, but it was very sweet to see his signature on there. And then the sort of momentum didn't build until a few years later for me in terms of the Stones. The first interviews with Mick and Keith would have been in 1995, so it was right around the 30th anniversary of that, when I was asked, I think because people in the record companies knew that I did both press, print journalism and broadcast journalism, which at that time was fairly rare. There weren't that many people that did both. So I suppose it was just that I knew my way around a microphone and editing and so on. So I was asked to do promo interviews, audio promo interviews with Mick and Keith for the Stripped album, which Stones fans will remember with fondness, as I do, as I think one of the more underrated entries into their later catalogue.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um, and I think I interviewed Charlie around that time. Anyway, the point is that it sort of set things in motion in terms of me being asked back, pretty much each time to
You
do
kind of
something.
endear yourself into the fold.
Kind of, yeah, or at least, I mean, the way I would describe that, because people always said to me, as it went on and on, people would say, "Oh, you're really friends with them now, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, no, I just, they asked me back because I haven't done anything bad."
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not just that, but with a band, even at that stage, even 30 years ago, this is a band that had been through everything and they'd been ripped off by everybody, including the media.
Hmm.
So there was an inevitable wariness from them about anyone coming onto the scene. And also it's a fast moving world. So a lot of people, by the time the next album or the next project comes along, it's somebody else doing the interview, and part of this is about sticking around, and doing essentially the same thing each time. And it kind of expanded into, because this was obviously quite unusual access to into their world. I was able to do a range of things from the same interviews, So there's sometimes these would be promo interviews to be used by the record company for international radio and so on. but I would be able to write a piece for the Times or, for one of the other papers in the UK, and then maybe to make a documentary for the BBC from them as well. All in full view, all sort of cleared and okayed up front. So that I think for them or for their team was, I think, a useful thing for them to or for them to get all the use out of one interview.
As you
Yeah.
said earlier, Charlie was a very reticent interviewee. I've had the pleasure of his company a few times. The first time we started speaking about XL and Main Street and then suddenly wandered off into jazz for half an hour. And that's clearly where his interest lies. Did you find that your relationship with him changed over the many times you were together? Was he easier to open up?
Yes, he was. And I found exactly the same thing as you. He would talk about the Stones projects that he was required to for as long as necessary. I mean, one of the sweetest and most friendly guys, in his own sort of distant way, if that makes sense. He's
Yeah.
very old school gentleman, as you know. Um, and so he was not what you would call gregarious, I don't think, but just, I always loved being in his company. But there's no doubt that if there was the opportunity to switch the conversation towards jazz, that he changed. He was a different person, and in later years, I would have done a few interviews with him specifically about some of his jazz releases. I remember one when he had the group, the A, B, C, and D of Boogie Woogie, the quartet,
Yeah.
with his great lifelong friend Dave Green and others. And so for fairly rarely, that was a specific interview about that project rather than us starting by talking about, either a new or a classic Stones album and maybe drifting into jazz later on. This was all about the jazz, and he just lit up, as a different person, as indeed he was on that first occasion when I mentioned that we were talking about the project inspired by Charlie Parker. Obviously there was some stuff in that conversation, but the bits where he really came to life were in talking about his heroes.
And I think for a lot of Stones fans, getting to know the real Charlie is sometimes a little bit better than hearing his perspective on the Rolling Stones, isn't it? You want to hear the man behind the drums rather than
Yeah.
just his memories of recording sessions or something.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he did have Charlie and Bill really were the ones with often with the the most vivid or the most the most accurate memories, should we say, of,
Hmm.
of of Stones recordings or tours or whatever it may be.
And we know why that is.
I don't know why that would be, although there is a period where that goes a bit hazy for him in the mid
Yeah.
80s, which maybe we'll talk about that. But yeah, I think that's right, and that actually was comes back to the treat, the real sort of privilege of doing the book because um, you I knew this already, but all the more so when you look back on it as a project, you realize that this is one of those very rare, I mean, maybe even the unique case of being having the opportunity to write about somebody who was so beloved worldwide, but that had never really been written about properly because he's so private,
Hmm.
and had never really sanctioned that in any sort of official way, nor cared about it. Didn't see why anybody would care about his life, and that's not it wasn't an affectation. It's just the way he was. So that combination of circumstances was amazing, really, as for me as a writer, because you wouldn't get that again. And you think about other potential projects or other subjects for the same kind of treatment, but I don't think there is anybody, that fits exactly those that description.
After Charlie passed and the project was still ongoing with you, the Stones had essentially approved it, I suppose, but was there any sort of hesitation or conditions on their authorization of the project? Did you have creative freedom?
I did have creative freedom, yeah, and that was an interesting process because the initial discussions were with the Stones management about the idea in principle. We got the green light on that eventually.
Yeah.
Um, and then, same thing with the band themselves. And I must say, Mick and Keith and Ronnie were so lovely. I mean, I've interviewed all of them so many times, but clearly this was a very different sort of conversation because he'd gone by then, and it was their chance to pay tribute to him. But the other factor, and the other really important thing, is that I sort of realized that I didn't want to do this. Well, I certainly didn't want to do it without their approval, and I also didn't want to do it without the involvement of other people who were close to him, and most notably his family,
Yeah.
who I didn't know, because they are as private as Charlie was. So we, I got an introduction. We opened up that avenue. I started, and being COVID time, a lot of these interviews were on Zoom.
Hmm.
So Serafina, Charlie's daughter, who is, you never see anything about. I mean, she's so low profile. Through her second husband Barry, we set up a Zoom call, and we just hit it off. I think they, dare I say, they could tell, that my aim was true. That my motives were the right ones, and that this was absolutely not going to be some sort of muckraking exercise, which again, they've been burned so many times. So that
Yeah.
was the initial wariness. And several of those conversations down the line, there was the point where I thought, well, I'd love it. It clearly would be wonderful if you would uh, actually officially authorize this. And they did. So when we were able to use that phrase, the authorized biography, I was thinking mainly that the authorization was from his family, but clearly it was from the band and the management as well. And there've been a few things that have happened since then. In fact, there was a recent thing that some people may have seen online. Perhaps you spotted this, that somebody came out with some kind of bogus. It's probably AI generated or something, but there is some kind of a book that claims to be, probably doesn't say official, but it certainly purports to be some kind of biography or book about Charlie, and his family put up one of their very rare messages on social media to say this is not genuine. And the only official book about Charlie is mine. So that was really touching because, it's just the latest kind of sort of validation of the whole project. And then we finally got a chance to meet when they were in London one time. They'd relocated by then and weren't in London very much anymore. But they came in for an event that we were all part of, and that was really nice to finally say hello to them. And we've stayed in touch. So it's just been just from a social point of view, really. Just been lovely
Yeah.
to make that connection.
Aside from his immediate family, though, it would have been incredibly challenging to write about Charlie's early life if it wasn't for his sister, Linda. She's somebody, again, who's very private and hasn't spoken about Charlie, obviously having known him since childhood. And also, as you mentioned earlier, his best friend, Dave Green. Like, how essential were these voices in you getting to know that part of Charlie's life?
Completely essential. I mean, to take Linda first, that was you're quite right. I mean, she's low profile to the point where I would say almost most people didn't know he had a sister. She's 3 years younger than him. I was put in touch with her by Charlie's longtime PA. So I think in doing that, that was, I hope, some sort of vetting procedure. It was like a sort of tacit approval, really,
Yeah.
for me to get in touch, which I did, and I went up to see her and her husband Roy, who she had known Charlie since you know teenage years, I think. And I'd realized, I'd found out quickly that this was actually the first interview she had ever done about
Wow.
him. She
Yeah.
just resisted everything before, and wasn't really part of that world. She was not really around in the sense that all the regular characters, many of whom you're speaking to, were around in the really old days. So she's very removed from that. But that was good in itself from a journalistic point of view because it was a different perspective. And then, she could talk about them growing up together. So I went up to do the interview, and they were wary. I could tell there was, by the body language, they were kind of wary at first, and they sort of sat on the edge of the chair, looking a bit nervous. But we had a lovely chat, and I think I hope I won them over. And by the end of the conversation, I remember saying to them, because the point I should make about all these interviews is that the other reason for great caution, or to tread very lightly, was that everybody was still grieving. I mean, Charlie had only recently passed away.
Of course, so they're very
Um,
fresh
very fresh,
scars.
and that was certainly the case with Serafina, and then her daughter Charlotte, who again was lovely. But I knew not to push too hard on certain things because it was just too upsetting for them. And that was certainly true with Linda. But at the end of the conversation, I said to her, not to upset you any further, but if you have any photos that, family photos that you would, care to share or consider us using for the book, here's my address, and we said bye-bye, and that was the end of that. And then I think about 2 weeks later, this envelope arrived in the post full of old family snapshots, some of which looked as though they'd actually been taken out of albums,
Yeah,
so originals. And I was completely knocked out by that because he was so trusting. And, I mean, that was another lovely validation for the project. And many of those people will have seen are in the book, of them playing in the back garden and
yeah.
kind of growing up together. So yeah, that was really very important. And then to answer your second point about Dave Green, I mean, number one of the sweetest men I've ever met, I think. I mean, just a genuine sweetheart.
I think
And
he'd have to be Charlie's best friend for all those
yeah,
years.
exactly. Yeah. And it's such a lovely connection because as you know, they were friends from very early on, next door neighbors in the prefabs in Wembley. Um, and soulmates because they found out, rather improbably at the age of whatever it was, 11 or something, that they were both huge jazz fans. So that was the bonding originally between them. And then, they just went down the same kind of musical path to start with and played in jazz groups together in their later teens, and traveled into town for their own gigs and other people's as well, and maintained that friendship right to the end. And Charlie, I remember, long before I met Dave, Charlie would always say, he always called him David. He said, David is always my first choice, for everything. I think he was probably involved in just about every jazz project Charlie ever did. And yeah, Dave really went above and beyond. A few people did actually, but he was so helpful in terms of photos himself and other contacts of people that they both knew. And we've stayed in touch, and he invited me to gigs. He's still gigging, as far as I'm aware. He certainly was recently, until recently, and been to shows of his. He plays double bass with a number of people at Pizza Express in Dean Street, where he's been hanging out for decades. And a beautifully modest man, so another lovely contact.
Did gaining the trust of Charlie's family, Linda, his wife, his daughter, his granddaughter, did that exert any extra pressure on you to make sure that you did a good job?
Yeah, it probably did. Um, but and this goes back to your question about involvement or approval. Uh, there was all this amazing level of cooperation from everybody because I think they wanted to see something, to see a tribute come out to him in book form. But there was absolutely no editorial approval, and there were one or two reviews that kind of hinted at the idea that the word authorized somehow means doctored,
Yeah.
or watered down or something, which is absolutely not the case. I mean, I can genuinely say that the first time anybody saw it was when it came out. So there was, I mean, obviously, with the exception of the publishers and editors and so on, but I mean, in terms of the family and the band, that was their first knowledge of it. So that was, a real compliment as well because you might expect that they would want to see what was going in. I think the point really about that is that, and this was one of the initial discussions with the publishers, that much as it was a it turns out, to be the first authorized book about him. I wouldn't say that there's anything dramatically new or, I mean, I hope there's lots of details about his private life that people didn't know before, but it's not like there's any kind of sudden huge revelation about, or controversy that people weren't aware of before. I mean, even his brief drug period in the 80s, people know about that already. So I think one of the reviews said, a book as gentle as its subject or something like that, which that might sound a little bland, but I took it as a compliment really because that was sort of my intention was to create that sort of vibe, because it reflected the way he was.
Was there anyone that you didn't manage to speak to that you would have liked to included?
There were a few that I just ran out of time for. Bernard Fowler was one. I know you've been speaking to Bernard, and one or two other members of the band. But that was really because of the nature of the timeline. Really, it certainly wasn't anyone saying no, I will not speak to you.
Yeah.
Because what really happened was there was that long period of discussing it, and then in the usual sort of hurry up and wait kind of way of the Rolling Stones, suddenly, we got here we are, we're in business. And the publishers by then had set the publication date because they were keen on it coming out around the first anniversary of his death. So suddenly it was TikTok.
Yeah.
Um, just a few people didn't quite make it, but no, for the most part, I was very lucky to reach nearly everybody that I was trying for.
I mean, you've said in other interviews that everybody you spoke to just had nice things to say about Charlie, and what you said earlier there about it being a nice book. Was there any part of you that wanted to try, as a journalist, to present a contrast in the man?
Um, yes, because otherwise you end up with something incredibly bland. And I think because, through the nature of his life and the longevity of the band, and there's so many improbable aspects of his life and career. Um, what was fun for me and rewarding for me was the opportunity. Speaking of somebody who's spent most of their life writing short form journalism,
Yeah.
for newspapers, where you rarely, in some exceptions, but you would rarely get the chance to go over a couple of thousand words, sometimes much less than that. The opportunity to write a book of 80,000 words obviously gives you the chance to go into real proper detail about things. And yeah, I think in the course of doing that, you know, some people might remember that the way I structured it was to make it broadly chronological, but with the occasional sort of pit stop to focus on a particular theme, whether that was Charlie's love of fashion or his collecting mania, um, or his incredible generosity. I mean, that was something I didn't expect that to be a theme, but it was because just about everybody I spoke to said that he'd given knocked out by the amazing gifts that he would always give and how thoughtful they were.
Yeah.
So there were all those aspects, and people did very kindly did pick up on some of those things as unusual aspects that they didn't know about him. So I hope it was a series of those rather than any one big reveal, about him.
Yeah, because I was going to ask whether in the process there was something you discovered that kind of changed your perception of Charlie.
Um, I mean, I suppose I knew about all of those things I was just talking about. I knew that all of those things were things he was very passionate about. Um, I suppose it was more to do with the depth of detail on some of those things, or stuff that nobody would know, like him and Charlie and Shirley turning up at a local event in the village where they lived, for so many years, and him just being incredibly supportive and staying till the end, and just being so down to earth, which clearly amazed people because they only knew him from afar. Um, and yeah, so that was definitely a part of it. And then there was another moment where, and I decided that this was never going to go in the book, but I found out during the course of doing it that he actually quite liked me as a journalist, which is a funny thing because it would never crop up. He's not the sort of person. I've been very lucky. If you do this for long enough, there are people that you do meet on a recurring basis, and some have become friends, and you're more aware of the relationship that you have. You wouldn't really get that with Charlie because he much as he was always very pleased to see you and very friendly, uh, this was still work. You're still in a work environment, and it starts and it finishes. But yeah, his drum tech told me that when I got in touch with him, he said he always said that he likes you, which is kind of strange. And it was kind of nice in a way that I didn't know that, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's mainly again a reflection of the fact that I was never I never had any need to pry too much. We didn't socialize really. I mean, we would just see each other on a pretty regular basis there for I don't know 25 years or something. And that's been the case with all of the band actually. And it still is. I'm due to see Ronnie this week for something, and there's another project which I've been involved with lately. That things bring us together in different ways, and then you go away again, and then you wait until the next time. So yeah, it's a nice way to work.
You mentioned Charlie's down to earthness. I mean, he began life in prehab housing in Wembley, in a city ravaged by war. Do you think that background, growing up in wartime, working class London, kind of shaped his worldview?
Yeah, definitely. And much as he became very wealthy, I would, he'd never lost his working class roots. Was very proud of them, I think. And you think this about a lot of those guys, mainly guys, who were suddenly thrust into stardom in the beat boom, let's call it that, that sort of period. And in some cases, it came out the other end, having thought they wouldn't last 2 years. It's all those famous quotes from them. They did, and then they turned into these absolute, gods that walked the rock globe, and you wonder about how they handled that. Some did, some didn't. Charlie did, but mainly by stepping away from it. Bill said to me, and I've interviewed him many times, but the new interview specifically for the book, he went into lovely detail about how he and Charlie bonded very early on because, I think in different ways, they both thought the world of celebrity was a bit daft, and they couldn't quite understand it and certainly didn't want to be part of it. I mean, Bill had fun in lots of other ways, and you could say he enjoyed his celebrity in a different way. But what tended to happen was that the two of them, even from very early on, they would just hang back. There is one story that comes to mind, which I'll just recount briefly, which is I think one of the very early press conferences in actually it wasn't in the States, it was somewhere in Europe, probably their first tour of that country, and they're all there, being wheeled out for the inevitable stupid questions because they really were. You
The
look at some of
banal kind of
these, yeah,
60s
just
questions.
absurd things, and what on earth is anybody supposed to do with those things? Um, but you can look at the body language and just the layout of the room. I mean, obviously Brian's there as well, so you've got the five guys. Mick's beginning to emerge as the leader by that stage. Keith is still a little shy, strangely. Brian is kind of somewhere in the middle of those, and then Bill and Charlie, I mean, physically at the back, just kind of leaving them to it. And Bill would say, "Yeah, we just be at the back talking about the cricket or something." And at the end of the press conference, the local publicist, I suppose, came up to Charlie, clearly starstruck. Never mind that all everybody else is in the room, but she's very starstruck. And says to him, Mr. Watts, could you give me some token to remember you by? And Charlie completely was like, what do you mean? And she goes, no, just something that I can look at or keep. And so he picked up the chair that he'd been sitting on and gave it to her, which was just that's classic Charlie sense of humor. It's a combination of bewilderment, superiority, um, and fun that he had. That it's like sort of poking fun at the whole occasion, really.
There was a line in your book, a quote from Charlie. He says, I give the impression of being bored, but I'm not really. I've just got an incredibly boring face. Do you
Yes,
think that kind of blasé image of him was a defense mechanism?
probably. And you can see in some of those interviews, there are some online, aren't there, of him being. There's one of him at home, I think, with Shirley quite early on, and this by now, I mean, this would have been about 1966 or something. So by now. you've got journalists and media who are wanting to really drill down and sort of get to be very serious about what really get behind the workings of this group and so on. And many of those came a cropper with Charlie because he just he wasn't interested in it. He didn't understand it. He didn't really know how to describe it. And so he would just either go completely silent or just destroy them with a one-liner or something.
Yeah, he could be quite harsh.
Yeah, he could. He could, yeah. There's that interview. I think it was David Hepworth on a, and it might. So I guess that must have been a when David was doing the whistle test, or maybe it was a special. But I think that's the one with the famous 24 years of a year of working and 24 years of hanging around, or whatever it was. Just he had this almost unique ability to downplay everything.
Or almost send it up in a way.
Yeah, he was. That's right. He was sort of setting it up and setting himself up, I think, and just pointing out how ridiculous certainly the whole cult of personality thing was. At a time when, I guess other members of the band were sort of going in the other direction. He just never saw it. He was often a loner, especially on tours. He would go out walking on his own wherever they were in the world, sometimes in the middle of the night, never went to the parties, um, didn't join in that sense at all. So when we did these new interviews, especially with the conversation with Keith, I was really struck by the fact that I mean, I think he said something along the lines of, he was an enigma to me, and I thought, well, if he's an enigma to you, then what chance have the rest of us got? Um, but that's quite telling, I think, in a way that he felt that they absolutely loved each other. That's the beautiful thing about you take any two members of that group, and there's this incredible affection between them and these different dynamics. And Mick was so affectionate about him and remembering them. I mean, they worked together closely on the visual side of the Stones. A lot of people
Yeah.
didn't know that, and one or two people picked up on that from the book. That with his background in graphic design, Charlie was hugely important to the look of the later, massive Stones stage sets. And then Mick would talk about how they would go out to exhibitions and how they would go to, Charlie was quite a big fan of disco, so he was the one that really enthused about that era, and Miss You in particular, that song, and
Hmm.
they worked on different versions of that. Um, he was also a reggae fan, which as Mick was, so there was a period much earlier when they were making Exile. I remember Mick told me this years ago how Chris Blackwell at Island Records would send him packages of singles, reggae singles. And it was really only Mick and Charlie that picked up on those and enthused about them. And in those days, they were much harder to get. A lot of these Trojan records and so on were rather more specialist than they are now. Um, and so that was the Mick and Charlie combination. And then you had the Charlie and Keith combination was a different thing again. I never interviewed, I don't think to this day, I don't think I've ever done an interview with Keith where he didn't say how lucky he was to play in a band with Charlie Watts. He didn't say that about the others, not that he was being nasty about the others, but it was a kind of a worship, actually, almost like a hero worship, from Keith towards Charlie.
Well, like you said, if he's an enigma, then there's something unknowing about it, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's like you said, a bit of worship, but also just completely curious.
yeah, yeah. Some of that is just to do with um, his sort of personal traits, just the way he was he was quite inscrutable,
Yeah.
really. And we touched on that, the idea of the one line put down. He certainly could do that. But yes, quite unknowable in a lot of ways, which people thinking, hang on, this is the official biographer. Why he shouldn't be saying that? But I found that very endearing. I like, I suppose that's just your personal taste, isn't it, in your your fellow humans. I like the idea of people who sort of don't just announce everything from the rooftops, and he barely announced anything at all, never mind from the rooftops.
In terms of Charlie being one of the most centered and grounded people in the band, one of the main causes of that was his wife, Shirley. How do you think the pair complemented each other?
Well, he always said that she she was very grounding. She was, I mean, she brought him right down to earth. She didn't take any nonsense from him at all. Um, and much as there were, he was naturally modest, there were times where he would get a little bit carried away with about the fact that he was a member of the Rolling Stones, and she would bring him right back down to earth. And Tony King, their longtime confidant, told me that lovely story about him coming back from a tour in early, 69 or something, around that time from the States. And she said he was so full of himself, about everything they'd done. And so she made him clean the oven. That's what their life was like, And Charlotte, his granddaughter, and they really, she just adored him. I mean, she, was just so lovely about him. Um, she said, and Serafina did too, I mean, life at home, whenever they would go back and visit, was just hilarious. I mean, when the Osbournes series came out, with Sharon and Ozzy. Um, they were like, "Oh my God, it's mum and dad," and with them as the kids. So, um, yeah, just and you got the other thing to add in here is that he was definitely OCD. That's another reason that he bonded with Bill because they realized they both were, um, really quite obsessive about the smallest detail, and he certainly was at home. I think Charlotte said at Christmas, a piece of gift wrapping would barely hit the floor before he picked it up and tidied it away.
It surely was from the beginning, always very strongly opinionated and quite independent.
Yeah.
How did she fit into the notoriously wild world of Stone's wives and girlfriends?
Well, she was certainly on a lot of those early tours, as they all were. And he loved that, and as they got older, um, if she would come out for some of the shows, then he would just uh, light up when he saw her and be very different, and this is his soulmate, I mean, they got married was 1964, wasn't it, I think,
Yeah, they
in
ran off,
secret,
didn't they?
or at least they thought it was, and they denied it. That was the funny. You saw the the press stories the following week, in which he said it's absolutely not true. It would be terribly detrimental to my career to be married, but he was, and Andrew spun that story a bit, and then he went off and got married in secret as well. So that was
That's
kind of
right.
funny. Um, but yeah, I mean, she fitted in really well to that world, I think, and obviously it was insane. I mean, certainly throughout the 60s and well into the 70s, this is a pretty wild world. Um, Shirley, sadly, was one I didn't get to speak to because she was not very well by the time we did the book, and I didn't get that opportunity. But the love between them absolutely rang through, in everyone's conversations about them. And he, e- especially in the period where he was talking about his own drug issues in the mid 80s, Shirley and Serafina pulled him out, really.
Hmm.
I mean, he did it. He got clean on his own, but really with his family saying uh, how dreadful he looked, and how his behavior had changed. And I think he knew he was going to be a goner if he carried on down that path. So, but yeah, just a real family man. So I think that whole unit was incredibly grounding, much as he would drive Shirley mad because
Yeah.
he'd get home from a tour and within about a week she's saying, "Go on, go and do something. You're in the way." No.
Yeah, somebody said that he didn't have any hobbies. He didn't know what to do when he got off stage. But as we would later find out, when we knew that he was an avid collector, he liked things, but certainly the extent of his collecting was almost unknown to his friends. I attended the preview of his collection at Christie's in London with Tony King, and even he was astounded at the amount of stuff that Charlie had amassed. He knew that he'd collected some stuff, but this stuff wasn't on display. It was kept in drawers, it was hidden away, and we're talking about first edition books. Uh, Incredible, expensive artwork, jazz memorabilia, everything. Just incredible amount of stuff. Why do you think Charlie collected so much? Was it just material possessions? Was it a comfort? Was it a control thing, having these things? Or was he just happy to have them?
he was certainly happy to have them. He enjoyed being able to afford them. I mean, for somebody from a working class background, as we touched on earlier, he was not. He never had any sort of aversion to spending money. But I think the flip side of that was his generosity. And I think no one ever said this to me specifically, and he certainly didn't. But I always had the feeling that he felt it was okay to indulge those hobbies, very expensive, collecting habits, because he was also very generous with all of his friends, and that was the other side of it. But yeah, I found that too. I was at that the Christie's event, and you may remember I did a Q&A with Dave Green and hosted by my good friend Jules Holland,
Yeah.
which was lovely to take part in. Again, amazing amount of love and affection in the room. But yes, I mean all of that stuff that was on, just the tiny fraction of stuff that was on display there, and then I must say Christie's did it extremely well. The way that the room with all of the all the books and the way that they were displayed. I think, yeah, none of us knew the extent of it,
No.
how vast this stuff was. And I think, like a lot of collectors, I mean, I'm a little bit like this with records sometimes, it's or other things. It's the having of them rather than the using of them, isn't it? It's just being able to look at them occasionally and sort of know that they're there rather than necessarily always playing them or reading them even or whatever it may be. But it was borderline out of control with Charlie, I think, and I mean, Serafina had the task while we were doing these interviews. They'd started the impossible job of clearing the house,
Yeah.
and so just starting, and we had, this is one of the ways we bonded because my mother passed away around that same time, and I was doing exactly the same thing on about a sort of 0.1% of the scale, because my father had died many years before, so this was myself and my two sisters going through all of our, the house that I grew up in,
Sure.
um, and just going through this endless stuff. So she had that times a million. And she's very funny again. She said, yesterday I found this thing in the bedroom. It was like just a little tin. And she said, is this like incredibly valuable or just a piece of crap? I don't know. So, quite bewildered by his collecting ways. But yeah, the same thing with the suits. Nobody could wear that many suits. Nobody could
No.
wear that many pairs of shoes.
He must have just bought new houses just to and put them in.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tony and I actually visited one morning and actually bumped into Bill Wyman, who was there, and he said the exact same thing. He's like, "Where did all this stuff come from?" Because you would go to Charlie's house, it wasn't there.
No, no, a lot of it was in storage. I mean, some of it was probably in storage from the moment he bought it,
That's
with
right.
some
Yeah.
vague idea that one day he might get to it, or that perhaps he finally would retire. Although I don't think that was ever going to happen, really, to be able to enjoy this stuff. And I think that's just part of, as you get older. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that you just got all this stuff, and what are you ever going to do with any of it,
Yeah.
and who's going to look after it in later years? Um, but yeah, he definitely would have done that. Some of the stuff would have gone straight into storage, but he also had, back to the OCD thing again, just the way everything was ordered. The place that he had in later years in Chelsea, everything laid out just so, and in meticulous color coded order for socks and goodness knows what else, and that was also the case on tour, of course. First thing he did when he got into his suite, having spent the whole of the day, the day before packing and getting everything into beautiful order, then he gets to the hotel on the first night of the tour and spends hours unpacking and putting everything in order. And Charlotte said, his granddaughter said, they would often just have a bit of fun and just move a sock out of place or something. You'd be furious, you know.
I did find it quite ironic looking at all the stuff that Charlie had that, here's somebody who's unimpressed by the trappings of fame, someone who kind of almost resents the position that he was in, and yet he's got all this jazz memorabilia like fans would collect. He had the Birdland flyer signed by Charlie Parker and Billie Holiday signed press pictures. It's weird that he'd be somebody who would identify with that level of fandom.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. The word is fan, and I think that's that's something you were aware of from very early on, even from that very first conversation about jazz and about Charlie Parker, or Miles or any of those people. He behaved like a fan would. He then became, much to his great surprise, in a position where he would often meet those people, or um, with the ones who were still around, be able to go and see them play live. In one or two cases, record with them. Um, and I mean, I remember when the Stones were looking for a jazz player to do the that lovely sax part on the end of Waiting on a Friend. Someone, it might have been Mick, said, "Let's try and get Sonny Rollins," and Charlie said, "You'll never get him," and because he was thinking of him as a fan, really, and worshipping from afar.
Like untouchable.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And, they did get him and he was absolutely amazed by that. Um, so that fandom never left him. He could tell you that, I mean, you mentioned a jazz album. He not only knows every track, he'd tell you what they were wearing on the sleeve, and almost the catalog number and that kind of thing. But again, I find that very sweet. And I think that led into his collecting nature, was wanted to have all of that stuff. And yeah, beautiful, not just the records, but as you said, and some of those things that were on display at Christie's, little handwritten notes by Charlie Parker to his common law wife, I think, and things like that, that no one knew he had. So, just as a piece of curation, um, Christie did a really good job.
Absolutely. There is a theory that it may have been Jazz and Charlie's romanticizing of the lifestyle that led him to that heroin addiction in the 80s. Maybe the way that he saw Miles and Charlie Parker and everyone else and their addiction to drugs influenced him a little. What's your take on that?
I think there's something in that, but only insofar as he was aware that that had been part of their story. Um, I mean, he was far too intelligent to just do it for that reason. I mean, it was far more complicated elements to it than that. And I think some of that is just reaching a certain age. He would have been in his mid, let me think here, no, 40-ish, somewhere around there, I suppose, at that point. Um, and so a little bit of the old midlife crisis may be going on, but mainly when he came out the other side, he said, I don't know what happened. I just became somebody else, which is what drugs do to people, of course.
Yeah.
Um, and he he was quite realistic about it. This was all happening at the time where this, and this would have been a factor in it too. The Stones were off the road. It's in that. It's not a coincidence that it's in that low point in the band's later history, where Mick signs the solo deal. Him and Keith are at loggerheads, to put it mildly, and drifting further and further apart. And the band is, they came as close as you can come to splitting up. Really, they just didn't. They just
Yeah.
left it, and then they came back.
So there's nothing for him to do.
Nothing for him to do, and the Dirty Work album came out, which is no one's favorite record, really. Um, so this was finally the chance. I mean, that's the period in which finally his name is on a record for the first time. As with one of the jazz projects, and even then only a live one at Fulham Town Hall, I think. And then he has the time to put that huge big band together. It's very tellingly as a gesture of goodwill towards his friends who ran Ronnie Scott's, because they were in financial trouble and he wanted to help them. So he, offered to do I suppose, a week of shows, put a band together for it, and went completely over the top with it. I mean, it's like 30 plus players. Dave Green, of course, being, I'm sure, the first call, and then this amazing lineup of the established jazz players and newcomers. But he did say at some point later on that if he hadn't been indulging at that point, he probably would never have had the confidence or the bravura,
Yeah.
to even approach that idea or to approach those people to do it, because he wouldn't have thought that they would care enough. Of course, they would. I mean, anybody would jump at that opportunity, obviously. So I think he was aware that, much as it led him down a very, very dark path, he was bright enough always to see what was the changes that it was making on his personality.
Yes, it's almost like jazz was his salvation as well.
Yeah, it was. It really did save him. You wouldn't say the Stones saved him, because for the rest of the 80s, it's that quiet period until they came back together around the time of Steel Wheels, and then you begin a whole different phase of the Stones' career, which is obviously the Enormous Dome shows and the massive stage sets and so on, which a lot of people, especially a lot of journalists, think of very disapprovingly. And I was certainly aware of that in the reception of the book. That I mean, I must say the reviews were lovely, and I suppose I realized that thing that artists have always said, which is that you always remember the bad ones, and there were hardly any, but there was one that kind of was rather disapproving of the fact that I was quite complimentary about later Stones records, as I am. I think I would never suggest that they would have been on the level of the classic period in their later decades, but I think it would be unreasonable to expect that. And if you really take the time with those records, there are gems on all of them. Including Hackney Diamonds, which I think was a huge effort.
Absolutely, but depending on what age you are, you may have a different gateway into the Stones.
Yeah.
I still have a huge affection for Bridges to Babylon.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And all of those records, you're quite right. I think that's a really important point about bands who've been around forever. Um, you might be tempted to think it's just the same old lags, sort of turning up every time to see them live or to buy the new release, but it's not. And there are new people coming in all the time and then starting out. And this would have definitely, I know it happened with Hackney Diamonds. You're not getting that level of success just from old fans being enthusiastic about it. There are new people coming on board at any given point, and Mick always said that. I remember he said to me, he said the Stones. He would often talk about the Stones in the third person, which is a odd thing. And sort of, the Rolling Stones are different things to different people. It depends where you came in. For some people, they've always been that sort of massive stadium band. Not everybody remembers them at the Crawdaddy Club or something,
Yeah.
So it is different. But I actually feel as though they and the whole band, Charlie, and would have certainly bought into this. They were more connected with their early days than you could have reasonably expected. And I think that the single most physical um, proof of that would have been the B stage on some of those later tours, where they're suddenly in the middle of a stadium and the bridge to Babylon, as it was in that early experiment, appears in the middle of the thing, and they walk down the walkway, and suddenly they're playing on this B stage, kind of as they would have done in 1963,
Yep.
and really well, may I add. So it hadn't come that far, too far away from their roots.
So we can't talk about Charlie Watts and not talk about his immaculate style, which is as deliberate and careful as his drumming. You spoke to people in your book that provided Charlie with some of his clothes straight from Savile Row. Why was image so important to Charlie?
I think because he just had that ethic of, you know, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing well. I mean, that sounds a bit simplistic, but it does go back to the fact that he enjoyed being able to afford these things. And the fashion of his jazz icons, his jazz heroes would definitely have played into this too. Um, and I seem to remember that his uh, Dario, Dario was his tailor at Huntsman in Savile Row, and then John, Dario's father, was his shoemaker in the arcade around the corner. And I think it was John who said, Charlie came in one day and said, "Right, what do I need now?" And he said, "No, actually, it's not a question of what I need; it's what do I want." So that goes into the collecting thing again, doesn't it? Just in sort of treating himself,
Yeah,
really,
indulging.
indulging himself, yeah, in that way. But it, I think it was always there. I think that love of fashion was there from very early on. You can see that from one or two of the pictures of him as a child in the book. There's that very famous picture of him with his parents in, I guess, is it Trafalgar Square and I think he's 3 and he's wearing a beret. You think it's quite and a lovely, well-tailored coat. So it was there from the beginning, but Yeah, I think it's mainly just that he had the money.
Yeah.
Why not? You wanted to enjoy life,
I also feel like it's perhaps um, a kind of quiet rebellion. He
Mm.
looks different. He's further separating himself from not necessarily the group, but kind of the excess of rock and roll.
Yeah.
He might be wearing very expensive clothes, but they look very clean and straight. And he's not Mick Jagger. He's not Elton John.
No, that's right, and it did set the way forward, didn't it? I mean, if you think about somebody like Brian Ferry
Absolutely, yeah.
from the next really from the next generation of rock stars, he um, I'm sure would have been influenced by that, and just this idea that you could look very separate from the rock and roll cliche, which was well established by then, and yeah, I think he definitely enjoyed that. I mean, you'd never see him in a pair of jeans. You see him in a t-shirt, but that was to play in because it was comfortable. And even then, he had them tailored, specially tailored with, so that they would just to make it easier to play the drums in. So yeah, for somebody so modest in so many other ways, you're right. There is a definite conflict because he just enjoyed looking good.
On the Stones' last tour that he was on, he was accompanied by his granddaughter Charlotte. In the book, there's a sense of mischievousness between them, and she seemed to provide some much needed energy. What kind of bond did they have, and how did it affect him on the road?
I mean, he absolutely doted on her and loved it when she was around on the tours. And that they because the Stones touring operation is so vast. I mean, that's a small corporation in itself, really. But the team gave her an official role at one point. Or they tried to make her his PA, and she said again in this really down to earth and beautifully endearing way. She said, "Well, that was pointless. There was nothing for me to do." It's like,
Because he doesn't want to do it.
no, yeah, I mean, he didn't need anything. He had it all with him already. So he just preferred for her to be around on the tour. And yeah, you do get the sense of them sort of playing around together. And she said that from as far back as a phrase which I use in one of the chapter headings of him having even as a younger man of him having grandpa energy, which I love that phrase because that's sort of a combination of this playfulness, but the kind of avuncular thing that we all picked up on is in later years, and that's just partly to do with getting older. I mean, if you look at a picture of Charlie in the late 70s with the sort of very short, almost like nearly skinhead cut haircut, you can compare that with only say I don't know 15 years later or something when his hair's going first grey and then silver. But that's I think of that with a lot of older people that I've known. As you see them becoming older, but it is men in particular, I suppose. I mean, there's something very endearing about that, and yeah, I think he quite enjoyed that role actually, in a way, and to be able to do that with his own family was quite a treat. And she was, still tearful when we were talking because they just, they miss him so much.
Of course.
It's very striking.
I mean, his death obviously affected everybody in the band. Everybody would have been distraught and torn up. I mean, I have heard that Mick was perhaps the most affected. Maybe they were the closest. They shared a love of cricket. They probably socialized a little bit more. How do you think it affected Mick in particular?
Well, I could tell by the tone of his conversation, in the interview for the book, that yes, he was extremely shocked by it, really, because it happened very quickly. He sort of said one minute we were discussing, designs for the next tour, and the next minute he was gone. So yeah, that was a particular bond between the two of them, and they did see more of each other socially. Cricket, as you say, being a huge bonding thing, as it was indeed with Bill. So they were all very very, very upset by it, but they had to think quickly, really, because there were plans afoot at that time, and they had to make the decision what to do. Fortunately, they had had these discussions, and they kind of they knew what they wanted to do. They discussed it with Charlie, and they moved forward, and I think they're right in saying that he would have wanted them to do that. I mean, he would have been genuinely appalled at the idea that the Stones would have stopped either permanently or even temporarily because of him, because it goes back to him being such a modest guy,
Absolutely,
So
yeah. So stopping was never an option.
not really, no. And again, this is the thing with any band that's been around for that amount of time, you're going to get people who think it's a sellout or that it's not the real band anymore. I mean, the Who get this all the time, and that's been a very salient point lately with their drummer issues of late.
Yeah,
Um, with Zach, who was clearly a brilliant replacement for, not that anyone could ever replace Mooney, but he was a fantastic choice for so long. So, you could say it's one further remove from the original group, but bands have lots of moving parts, don't they? And the time will come when that will be it, but I don't think it's yet. And the thrilling thing, of course, for anybody, and I say this as a fan, was to hear Charlie there playing on a couple of tracks on Hackney Diamonds. I mean,
yeah,
I just thought that was a lovely thing. They didn't have to do that. Mick, for all of Mick's, perceived, what's the word, sort of showmanship and perhaps egotism. Some people interpret it that way. There's a very soft side to him, and I know he in particular wanted to honor Charlie in that way, and Bill's on the track as well, of course. Um, and there was some material left over, so who knows? I think there's some of the stuff they didn't use for Hackney Diamonds. Charlie was on as well, so he certainly lives on that way, and actually in every way, really.
absolutely. Well, in his foreword for your book, Keith Richards called Charlie a presence. So,
Mm.
what do you think may be missing from the group, or what was it that he lent to the group just by being there?
Um, well, I think the idea of less being more. He was a master of that. Although at the same time, he had this absolutely um, boundless and deceptive energy. Never mind the grandpa energy off stage that we were talking about. I think just as a player, and Mick said this to me, that he was amazed sometimes that Mick said, "I can take a break if I want. I can, I don't have to run up and down the stage like I do all the time. I can go off for a number." They structure the show that way, of course. With in the later years when Keith would do his spot, Mick would be off, doing the next costume
Yeah,
change, but taking a breather. Charlie's there the entire time, for 2.25 or 2.5 hours or something. And these are, um, for the most part, exacting songs to play on. So he had that amazing energy, but he just seemed to do it. You looked at him; he was so great to watch, wasn't he, as a drummer, because he just looked like he wasn't doing anything, And that's different now. It's fair to say, but that's just the nature of how unusual he was as a person, and just his whole demeanor was just not that of a rock and roller, and certainly not of a rock drummer. I mean, him and Bonzo, John Bonham were great friends. Him and Mooney were great friends. But they were there with every bell and whistle you could imagine, Bonzo in particular. And Charlie's sitting there with like a seven-piece kit.
yeah.
It's incredible.
So, to anyone who hasn't yet read your book, or anyone that wants to discover the man behind the kit, what do you hope that people will take away from reading your book now?
Well, I hope people will continue to sort of glean from it that he was just in many ways was a regular bloke, not a member of the sort of rock and roll elite in any way. Didn't want to be, distanced himself from that completely as much as he could. Um, but that had, as we've been discussing, that had all these very unusual traits to his personality and different aspects to himself as a human being, not as a rock star, but just as a human. All of the collections and the love of fashion and things that we've been touching on. They come through again and again. I think it'd be nice for people to realize what a lovely, generous man he was, both with his time for people like me and with his friends, with his incredible generosity and so on. And I suppose my hope would be that the picture that you build up is just of somebody that will never be replaced, really, both as a musician and as a person, because he was unique.
And were the Stones and the family ultimately happy with the book, as you were?
Yeah, as ever, it's hard to glean, and this is in the nature of what I do, that we would have. There would be a little gap before I saw any of them again, but yeah, they were. And the next time I saw Mick, which actually would have been when we were doing the interview for Hackney Diamonds, he was really nice about it, and he was very happy to hear that it was traveling the world. We did the joke about he's still on tour and so on. And yeah, I mean, really, I could turn it around the other way and say, hey, if they didn't like it, I would have known about it pretty quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. So since your paths continue to cross, do you see yourself writing any more Stones related books, or was this more of a one of a kind thing for them?
I mean, it feels to me like a one of a kind at the moment, but you'd never say never. I must say, and I touched on it much earlier on, that when people, including friends of mine, began to notice that I was, doing more repeatedly, seeing them or doing stuff with them, people would say, "Why don't you do a Stones book?" And I used to say, "Well, no, people don't need another Stone. There's thousands of the things, And it's like I've had very privileged access into their world, but it's not unique access. There are people, whether it's one or two other writers or Martin Scorsese with the films that he's done and so on that have had that sort of access as well. But yeah, I mean, I would never rule it out. And as we go further and further along, I mean, we've certainly, it's no secret we've had discussions about other similar things, but really, Keith's done his book, Ronnie's done his book, and Mick doesn't want to do a book. So it wouldn't be that kind of a treatment, but it's certainly not out of the question that there couldn't be a different treatment. So we'll see.
So what might be next for you? Any other musical figures you'd like to explore in biographies?
Well, there are, and this has been under great discussion as well. I'm actually working on a book. In fact, I'm a long way into a new book now, which we haven't announced yet, so I won't go into great detail about it. But it's a very different sort of a project. It's much more of a, it's not Stones related, not directly Stones related. They pop up in it actually at one point, but it's much more of a kind of musical, an aspect of music history, very British music history, which I'm working on and very deep into and done dozens of interviews for. But yes, there are still people that I would love to write about. Sometimes the problem with that is you can't avoid the sort of the commercial conversation because a lot of the people that I am fascinated by probably wouldn't get well, you get a deal, you'd be able to write about them, but I suppose I've been spoiled to do this on a fairly big scale with Charlie. So that remains to be seen whether any of those sort of pipe dreams will come to fruition. But most people, this is the thing, by now most people have either had the biographical treatment or they've done their own book. I mean, just to give you an example, at one point I was thinking, well, Bernie Taupin's a really interesting character. What about him? And then the next thing, almost the next day after I'd had that thought, he announced his autobiography, so that sort of takes care of that. But there is something to be said for the idea, perhaps with a distance of time, for the biographical treatment, simply for the reason I mentioned earlier, that it gives you a different, I hope, a series of different perspectives on a person. I do find sometimes with an autobiography that it's because it's necessarily all in the first person. They can be a bit relentless sometimes, I find, and whether that's a music biog or anybody else's. I do like the idea of lots of different voices in things. So we'll see.
Well, good luck with whatever you do next.
Yeah, Simon.
And that brings us on to 5 by 5, which is the 5 regular questions that I'm
Okay.
asking everybody. Quick fire questions. Number one, what is your favorite Rolling Stones song?
I could make a case for lots of later ones. I mean, I have a lot of fondness for many later songs, even some that might surprise people, like Mixed Emotions, for example, or
Yeah.
later period material. But I suppose I'll go for something from the classic period. Let's say Tumbling Dice.
What is your favorite Rolling Stones album?
by extension, I suppose I probably am going to land on Exile, because, well, for lots of reasons, including having worked with them on the reissue of it, and doing interviews with them for that. So yeah, that Exile will do for me.
What is a deep cut or underrated Stones track that you think deserves more love?
Depends how deep you want to go. I mean, I suppose so. You wouldn't be talking about singles, really, would you? Or
Well,
you
I
want?
want a lesser known one.
Okay. Again, it depends on how much, how familiar people are with the catalog. I could say something like "Waiting on a Friend" because not everybody knows a song like that, which I think is an extremely underrated Stones single. Or, gosh, I mean, from a later period, I might say "Mixed Emotions." Actually, maybe one of the last great sort of Stones rockers. Um, there's a track on, actually on Steel Wheels, which would this will be a surprising choice, but there's a track called Continental Drift, which is actually just a very African influenced, uh, largely instrumental, which they used as the play on music for that tour, which is very powerful. Um, I need another half an hour to think about it. Is the answer to
There are
that?
many choices.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what makes the Rolling Stones such an enduring and influential band?
Hard to sum it up in a sentence, really, but for all of their incredible, global domination and wealth and all the rest of it, I think they've never lost the ability to connect to people one to one, and as we've gone along, I think that's been more through their live performances perhaps than with their records for everybody other than diehard fans. It's something to do with the combination of characters, and that seems to survive the passing years and the slight changes of personnel. Um, I know they're very aware of this. There's something about when they all get together. Doesn't matter what they've been through, for all of the trials and tribulations that they've had, and the people who've passed away or have left or whatever it may be. There's something about the thing called the Rolling Stones that is just very, very special, and I know they feel that too.
It's bigger than all of them, isn't it?
It is bigger than all of them. Yeah, I think that's right.
Lastly, then, if you could describe the Rolling Stones in just three words, what would they be?
Exciting, dangerous, and if it's two words, if I'm allowed that, constantly evolving. Evolving would be the word.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Paul.
Simon, it's my great pleasure.
That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. As ever, I do implore you to please subscribe to Lip Service because there's lots more to come that you don't want to miss, and give us a like or a review or a comment while you're there. For other news and extra stuff, find us on all the socials at Stones Lip Pod. We're going to take a short break for the holidays, so the next episode will be with you early in the new year. Till the next time, we say goodbye.